podcast. Today we have Ziad Ramlawi. He's a retired Palestinian Lebanese businessman and founder of the group Movement for Humanity and the coalition between Veterans for Peace and Movement for Humanity, of which I'm also a part. He's been organizing and teaching the Greensboro community about what is happening and what's continuing to happen to Palestine under US-backed wars, under Israeli rule, under Hamas rule, particularly Israel's attempts to divide the Palestinian community by, in some points in their history, supporting Hamas in order to undermine the PLO. He's here today to tell all of this, plus his personal story, and just discuss the history of and the present of Palestine. Thank you for coming on today, Ziad. How do you feel?
Thank you for having me. I feel great.
That's good. First off, I want to present to you this book. It's Nur Masalah's Palestine, a 4,000-year history, because I think you could make really good use of this book. And in some of the previous discussions we've had, the things that I started to talk about, like my perspective, really come from this book. So first off, this is for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It'll be great for me to read. Yes, I need to know more than just the history I lived through when I was in Palestine.
Well, the reason I want to talk to you is because you've spoken out against this persistent narrative. And it's a narrative that's pushed by the mainstream media, it's pushed by politicians, it's even pushed by just moderates, people who don't know better, that Israel would have been satisfied by compromise and peace. But there's a saying that Arabs never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I found some things that complicate that narrative. For example, at different points in history, Israel was willing to accept the so-called UN partition of 1948. But then in private statements, Zionists like Ben-Gurion said, and here I quote, "A partial state is not the end, but only the beginning. The establishment of such a Jewish state will serve as a means in our historical efforts to redeem the country in its entirety." So he's saying there that they're only accepting the 1948 partition as a trick, as a farce to get the foot in the door. He said also, "I favor partition of the country because when we become a strong power after the establishment of the state, we will abolish partition and spread throughout all of Palestine." And what you've brought to my attention is that at some points, Israel has actually supported Hamas as a way to divide Palestinians, undermine the PLO, and undermine the prospects for peace that could have existed. Can you tell me more about that?
Certainly, yes. Hamas was founded in 1987, right along the time when the Intifada started in the West Bank. The Intifada in the West Bank was peaceful and self-initiated. It had support from the outside Palestinian groups, particularly back then it's called the BFLB, Democratic Front, and the BFLB. So is the military wing of Fatah. Mm-hmm. The most active at that time was the BFLB Democratic Front, which was a leftist front. Believes in the communist or the Marxist-Leninist way. So Israel thought that if they can create a movement, which is an Islamic movement, since at that time the understanding that Muslims do not accept communism, and we saw that in Afghanistan in the 70s, for example, during the invasion of Afghanistan, how they supported the Muslims in Afghanistan to fight the communist Russia. They thought they could do the same in Palestine by having the Palestinians fighting among themselves. By to say the least, look in the other side when they saw Hamas started and building itself up, so they can fight among themselves to fight the communists, who are the ones who created the more trouble at that time in the West Bank.
I see. And why did the resistance choose a Marxist-Leninist ideology initially? Was Israel seen as an outpost of capitalism? How exactly did that ideology merge?
Back in the 70s, and at that time I was still a student in college. The Palestinians actually were not so much like today, where you have a lot of conservative Muslims. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of nationalist, but they do believe we were more open to accept ideas like the leftist ideas, the communist idea. Fatah was the only group which really was conservative, not as far as conservative Muslims, but they are not lined up with the left. So you could find in Fatah, for example, which is the biggest part of the PLO. That's the part which was headed by Arafat at that time. You could find both sides. You could find the conservative Muslim, and you can find the leftist in the same group. That's why Hamas was not there at that time. I'm talking about the 70s, because there was hardly any conservative Muslim movement for liberation. Now, you asked me the question, why are they lined up with that, since they're fighting imperialism? Well, we all, at that time, we believed that the left or the communists is more or less fighting the capitalists in the West.
Right.
So they said that we can line up with the left in order to fight the capitalism, which is in Israel, supported by the United States.
That's actually pretty interesting to me, because at different times, from what I understand, in the history of the Soviet Union was also very strategic in when it chose to support Israel. Am I right? At some points it was more supportive of Israel, and maybe at other points was it more supportive of Palestine?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, for my best of my knowledge, the Soviet Union recognized Israel, one of the first countries to recognize Israel. Today we know, for example, for sure, that both the United States and the Soviet Union was looking after their own interest.
Right.
So whatever their interest was, whether it's with the Palestinians or with the Israelis, they will line themselves up. Back in the 70s also, they had some interest with the Middle East, particularly with Egypt and Syria, because they were buying the arms from them. They were arming these countries. So they were not really clear on their support for Israel, but we knew that they did. Till today, as a matter of fact, if you would remember back when they came to Syria, they had talks with Israel so they can draw the maps where they can be and where is it. So we know that even Russia today has still strong relations with Israel.
I see.
So our relation with Soviet Union back then and today was not strategic.
I understand. What I also find interesting. Wait, so you said it's not strategic?
No.
But I thought you just said it was strategic.
No, it was not strategic. There was a group of people who felt that the way to liberate, as a matter of fact, they used to say the way to Jerusalem is through Moscow.
Really?
Yes.
That's actually very interesting to me.
Yeah, but it's not it was not being adapted by the majority of the Palestinian groups. It was adapted by the minority of the groups. There was several Palestinian organizations on the ground. To name some of them, the biggest was at that time Fatah, and then there was the BFLB, the Democratic Front, BFLB Lone, and the Arab Front in Iraq, and several other fronts in Syria. Two of them was really lined up with that ideology of the left, the communism ideology, not so much lined up with the Soviet Union.
I see. To me, that's somewhat ironic, because Theodore Hess, one of the first Zionists, and the other person, I'm blanking on his name, they were actually pretty devoted communists, because their thinking was that was a type of messianic political theology. Instead of a human Messiah, what Hess and the other early Zionists believed was that Israel was a political Messiah for them, that the time had come where they could disregard sort of traditional natural law and traditional ethics and do whatever they wanted. And so I'm curious, why is well, it's just interesting that side of the history isn't remembered to me. So I wonder if there was ever a moment in time where Palestinians felt opposed to communist ideology, specifically because of what the ideology itself is. Because if you believe that there is one single system in history, or one single force in history, or one ideology in history that will always be responsible for all the imperialism and all the evil in the world, then that can cause you to overlook when people who hold those ideologies are actually the ones that are committing those very same acts.
I want to distinguish in here between the Palestinians and the conservative ones,
Right.
the Muslims,
Mhm.
The Palestinians, like I said, back in the 70s, were not really conservative Muslims.
Mhm.
They were moderate Muslims. And a very big number of them was really open, more or less open to the communism ideology.
Mhm.
That's why, and they also remember that since the United States was supporting Israel, and at that time, now we're talking about ideology more than the facts on the ground.
Right.
The Soviet Union was representing anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism. That's what they were representing,
Mhm.
although that they were acting in some cases different. And the United States was representing the imperialism and the capitalism.
Yes.
So since you have nothing from your own, you'd have to line yourself up with one of those ideologies.
Mhm.
So would you rather choose the one who's fighting you, or
Right.
would you rather use the one who at least saying that they are against the one who's fighting you in
I see.
ideology? So a lot of them find themselves believing in communism, not so much about the ideology itself. It's because they feel they are closer to that ideology than being closer to the capitalism and imperialism, which was represented at that time by the United States and the West.
Mhm.
So it's so much in.
So at that time, the association between capitalism and imperialism was really solidly held
Yes.
by most people.
Yes.
And what do you personally think of that?
I was never really. I was so much tuned into the nationalism, which is a
Yeah.
Palestinian who wants to liberate Palestine and create a democratic state in Palestine, a secular, non-sectarian democratic state in Palestine, where all nationalities and religion can live in peace in Palestine. So I never really lined myself up with any of those ideology. I kept on the national perspective of it.
I see. Well, what I mean is, it's ironic to me. I mean, some of the early Zionist settlements were actually like socialist kibbutz. Some of the early like Zionists were sort of had that messianic communist idea that by creating a perfect world through a political ideology, that they're liberating themselves, that they're like becoming the new Messiah. And that was a really prevalent theme in the 1800s, maybe earlier in the Zionist movement. But like a century later, it had totally flipped. And now socialism was viewed as liberation against the Zionist capitalist oppressor, basically.
That's true.
Yeah.
Just let's remember that a lot of those settlers who came in after
Yeah.
the Second War came from East Europe and from the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
So they were really influenced by their past.
Mm-hmm.
And their past was in communism and in socialism. So, and another thing is, you will find this true in Israel today,
Right.
that those people are the less religious part
Mm.
of Israel.
Right.
And that's why we call them the Zionists, because they were not really so much a religious group. It was a group, an
Right.
ideological group, a group who has an ideology. That's why you said that they believed in the kibbutz, the communism,
Right.
and they believed in the new Messiah
Mm-hmm.
through that. It's really influenced by their past.
Yes.
But if you ask a Jew, any of the Jewish community who are Palestinians, and we have a lot of them, for example, we still have a lot of Palestinian Jews live within the Palestinian communities, particularly to name one.
But religion is very important to them.
Yes, but
Yeah.
they are Palestinians,
Yes.
and they live next to a town called Nablus,
Yes.
and they are Palestinian Jews. And those have lived with us forever, and they would rather have Palestine go back to before the Zionists came in.
Right.
And they would tell you, that we were at peace when we were living in there. We still are at peace. So there is really a difference between the Zionists,
right,
and the Jewish people. There's a big difference. In my point of view, I think Zionism have the first victim of Zionism is the Jews before the Palestinians. And if you just look at the history, you'll find out that it was built from the 1800s till the First World War and the Second World War, when they are in their weakest point after the Holocaust. They used them to force them to come out of Europe to Palestine on the hope of living before anything else. So we should know that they are the victims of Zionism.
I agree. There's also a book and a talk done by a professor, and I forgot the professor's name, but the name of the talk he did is Zionism, a contradictory and traumatic ideology. And what he said in that talk is that because even disassociating from Judaism, from the religion, didn't get the anti-Semites to stop harassing them, then Jews felt the need to define themselves as an ethnic group bound more by blood, but similar to other nationalist movements in the 1850s. That was a time when the idea of having a national identity based off shared ancestry rather than being ruled by a king in a foreign place was really, really prevalent. You saw the nationalists in Italy and Eastern Europe. And so Jews did, to some extent, they did the same thing. There's this one quote that's really, really surprising. And it's by one of the early Zionists. I can't remember which one, but he says that, well, if other nations lived the same way we do, then we would hate them too. In order to justify anti-Semitism, in order to justify Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism, I should say. And that's sad. I mean, that's real. But now, the political reality we have now it's really totally the opposite in my view. I've been to we spoke about this Thursday. The first college that I went to when I just started university was Northwestern, and it's a very well-connected school. It's a very influential school, and there, even if you were progressive, that school happens to be very, very pro-Zionist, like many other American colleges. That's why the students of Columbia, the students of Harvard, and students of Yale and other universities that had mass protests and encampments was really, really surprising to people, was because typically the influential and well-connected, so not the oppressed, but the influential in society are the ones who support Israel now. And so it's another way that I think that shows to me that a person's reason for having an ideology doesn't justify the ideology itself.
It is unfortunate that a lot of people in this country do not know about Zionism. And we really need to do a better job on educating people. First question I ask anybody is, what does Zionism do for you in America? Sometimes we talk about some political parties, whether it's the Democratic, Republican, or Libertarian, and they do something for you. They either come out and they say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this for you, we're going to make your life better, we're going to reduce your taxes. But what does Zionism do for you? And I say that because our president just came out and said, I'm a Zionist. Then he said, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And that statement tells me, okay, I'm going to be a Zionist now. What's that going to do for me? So it doesn't do anything. You need to know more about Zionism. We really need, here in America, we all need to know what is Zionism. A lot of people are misinformed through the major media that Zionism is tied into the Jews. Zionism is not a religious movement. It's an ideology connected to imperialism. The advocation that we need to go to a country and establish another country.
It's non-voluntary.
Yes.
It's like, why would Palestinians accept that foreign powers partition their land for a state that's not meant for them?
Or if we want to take the other way around and say, okay, what if we are here in America, China decide today to come in here and say, okay, we'll go to America and establish a Chinese country in here and drive everybody out. And actually, Zionism is the most, the bloodiest form of imperialism.
Right.
Now, what we saw, for example, in South Africa, the apartheid rule back in there, it did not call for the genocide of the black.
Mm.
They called only to rule the country.
Right.
But Israel is calling for the genocide, for the ethnic cleansing. You either stay, if you stay here, we're going to kill you, or you leave. So it's the bloodiest form of imperialism is the Zionism. And I think we all need to spread that word out. This is exactly what you hear today from Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, led also by Netanyahu, that the whole goal is that Israel will become not only, as they say, it's a Jewish state, it's going to be a Zionist state. That's why a lot of Jews who say and otherwise are pretty much restricted to be there. The doctor we had the other day, he said that since he said that, they're not going to give him permit to go back. And I know a lot of my friends who are Jews who talks against Israel, and they are not allowed in Israel, or they get arrested if they go on there.
Wow.
So this is a Zionist state, and they are not shy about it. They say it is. You know.
Yeah.
You see that in their meeting, they have Herzl, Isaac Herzl pictures hanging on their walls. Mm-hmm. So they're not shy about it. The only thing is, we here in America should ask the question: is Zionism, is it American? Is it something we do need in America? Is it going to be a form of government? Is it going to be a foreign party? And if it is, what is it? Everybody has to ask that question. And then from here, I say the first one who has to ask the question is the people who voted for in our legislation to equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Mm-hmm. Those 435 members. It
takes away free speech.
Yes. And those 435 members who voted for it, or some of them did vote to pass the law, needs to know what is Zionism. Is it something American or is it un-American?
I'm saying it's pretty un-American. I mean, if you consider the American Constitution to be a guideline for morality, then you believe it's generous to give what's yours. For example, if I were to give away this computer, then that's me being generous because it's through my own volition, it's through my own will. But if I were to give away someone else's computer, or give away a computer I never owned, how can that be considered generous? And so when I hear people say that, and when I went to Northwestern and I went to more Zionist, I had more discussions with Zionist areas, like this sort of basic reflection on morality of the morality of making a proclamation like the Balfour Proclamation just didn't seem to occur to them. To them, their background, the idea that because Jews were once oppressed, then they can do whatever it takes to prevent any future oppression, or because Zionism sort of aspired to noble sounding ideas, ideas about justice, and then that makes it just that you have to support it. It completely ignores the reality of how Zionism was actually enacted, like the Nakba, for example. I've listened to debates about what happened that actually caused the Nakba, and pro-Israel people will say that the Arab armies invading, actually is what's to blame for the Nakba. But then if that's the case, then why is Israel not making any effort to relocate those Palestinian refugees back to their home? So there really is an exclusive ideology that drives Zionism and imperialism.
Definitely. And as I said in the speech the other day, Israel had 77 years to prove its
Right.
a good faith that they are a not only democratic country but also free for the people who for themselves, the Jewish and the Palestinians, and I hate to always compare between religion and ethnicity. But they have proven the opposite. They have created an apartheid system.
It's like a country where, to use George Orwell's quote, everyone's equal, but some people are more equal than others.
That's correct.
Because if you're judged under the Israeli civil court system, like for example, the case where the Palestinian boy got into a fight with an Israeli boy, and they were 13 years old, and the 13-year-old Palestinian was charged in the military court and put in prison, and the Israeli boy was treated like it's just a childhood fight because they're in different court systems, then how can that be equal? It's completely unequal.
It is. And now, let me tell you about some of my personal views on let me put it this way: I was born in Jordan.
Yes.
In first time I went to Palestine is in 1995 after the Oslo Accord.
Right.
And I was so anxious to see that country, which I've always had dreamed to be in it, because it was so it was impossible almost for any Palestinian outside the West Bank to go and visit. As a matter of fact, between 1967 all the way to 1973, even if you have close family members like children, or parents, you couldn't visit if you got out of the war.
Right.
So I was so anxious to go and see Palestine, and I had a brother who worked with the Palestinian Authority at that time under Arafat, so he had the leverage to drive me around. And in one of the places I wanted to see is Haifa.
Right.
Haifa was where my dad used to work when he had to leave during the war. So I wanted to go and see Haifa, and it was shocking to me how you drive through the Israeli part, where it's so modern, and instantly when you start getting to the Arab neighborhood, instantly you can see it's all different. The roads, the buildings, the infrastructure is totally different. And that gave me the idea, the idea that Israel was not in there to accommodate the Palestinians as being part of the society. They always has rules to squeeze them and get them in a hard
to make a voluntary migration away.
Exactly.
It is to make it life so difficult in the occupied territories that people choose to move away, so that way Israel doesn't have to say they're doing ethnic cleansing, but that's de facto what it is.
And that's what they're doing in the West Bank today. If you see that they go into these cities, and what they do, the first thing, they brought those bulldozers and they tear up the infrastructure, which becomes harder for the people to live in there. Ultimately, somebody who has a weak national connection may say, well, I want to leave, I want to go and find my future somewhere else.
Right.
So that's their policy since 1948. Right. And that's defy the fact the fact that they are a democratic state. First thing, they are not democratic.
Mm-hmm.
They maybe are democratic for the Israelis, but for the Palestinians, they're not. And another thing I was going to mention is, in a lot of talks is talking about all the time the occupied territories, and this has been occupied since 1967 for the West Bank and Gaza. And if you figure that out, we're talking about some 57 years since 67.
Right.
The war stood up. The whole Western world to advocate human rights, freedom, democracy, and always stood up to watch the Palestinians stay under occupation. The only thing they say is, as an occupier for Israel, you need to be responsible. You need to be responsible occupier. But none would ever come and say, we need to end the occupation.
Whether it's legitimate in the first place.
Yes.
Right.
And in here is also something I need to say, and it's the face of the Western democracies have been really exposed after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
I came into this country and I loved it because of the freedoms, the freedoms we have, which is freedom of speech,
Right.
expression. It was a great country.
Right.
And today I see all these big things they were fighting the Soviet Union with, which is freedoms, liberties, is gone. It's going. Gradually, it's going away. And this is something maybe out of the subject, but a lot of us here in America needs to also look and see what do we need to do to go back to what our founding fathers founded this country for, which is the freedoms we have.
Right. That's because. So that, to me, that's interesting that you say that, because the way that some Palestinians thought in the 1970s that the solution to liberation was like liberation comes through Moscow, like you described. That's pretty different than what you're saying now. And so how do you judge ideas? Like, when you said that the face of the Western world was being exposed as hypocrites, and so it actually needs to go back to its roots. So you actually, that tells me that you actually do view liberalism as an ideology that views everyone equally. You do view the American idea.
Well, as I said,
as an idea that views everyone equally. That's pretty different than what some people.
Well, definitely, there's a lot of good ideas in the West. Earlier, what I said is we strive to establish a democratic, secular, non-sectarian state in Palestine, and that is pretty much this similar to the model in the West, not so much into the model in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. The only thing is, like I told you, some of the Palestinians found themselves lined up with Moscow or with Soviet Union back then because on the other side, where they're finding Israel, the United States is standing up with them. So they couldn't be possibly justifying the fact that we can line up with that ideology or that, and still finding the same enemy. But as I told you, for me, myself, I never really lined myself up with that. I was always a nationalist. And I think the West has great ideas, and the West proved, actually, throughout the life I've lived, that they could do a lot of good things on all levels. But I feel that, sometimes some people say it's good to have an enemy than to not have one, because they'll keep you straight. And I think the United States and the West were kept straight when the Soviet Union was in power. Look at our country.
Because they had to have the moral high ground when the Soviet Union.
That's right. That's right. The only way you can fight the Soviet Union, that's how they brought the Soviet Union down, is by showing our moral high ground in here, the freedom, the liberty, the human rights. And they always call the Soviet Union is the ones which has oppressed its nationals. But once the Soviet Union fall, we have really forgot about all these and probably adapted to what the Soviets. I'm saying gradually we're adapting to what the Soviet Union adapted, which is taking some of these liberties and rights away from our citizens. I mean, anybody can tell you that some of our leaders who came in after the Soviet Union is some of the ones who starting to become less democratic. Right. George W. Bush, and thereafter, we have the Trump, who advocate,
stealing the election.
So, but look at
the U.S. became more like the Soviet Union after it toppled.
Yes.
The Soviet Union.
Or let me say that they have really forgot what they were fighting the Soviet Union for. All these high morality slogans, and they forgot them since now they don't have an enemy. But for example, growing up, a lot of countries were attacked by the United States as non-democratic, or for example, China. And if you remember, during the Tiananmen Square, non-democratic, no human rights. Till today, they would say that. That's how they brought the Soviet Union down, is by exposing them that didn't have what we have.
Right.
But since the Soviet Union is gone, we have to present all these good values for them to bring them down. We didn't have nobody against us anymore, or as big as we are, to bring down. So now we start losing all these freedoms and civil rights and liberties gradually. Started with George W. Bush with the Patriotic Act, which happened in 2003.
Well, I wonder what our friend Tim would say, because in the group chat the other day he posted that he believes basically because of liberalism, because it's a false ideology, that both the U.S. and Israel need to be overthrown. And so some people see, I guess, what you would call the imperialism of Israel as the result of human action, of people deciding to dehumanize others. Whereas actually, I think the idea that the system is what's responsible for human action, the systemic explanation of the immorality we see, is actually really, really popular in this generation. I mean, because you hear, it's not just Tim, you hear that all the time. You hear people say that, well, the system needs to change in order for peace to be brought to Palestine. It's inevitable because the system, the economic system of liberalism, of constitutionalism, makes the wars inevitable. And you actually disagree with that. So what do you say to the people, who you disagree with? Because you're obviously very willing to work with them.
Well, the way I understand it, when they're talking about the system, and not Tim in here, we're talking about that the system of governing.
Yes.
The two-party system, as we always say, this is a democratic country. But the two-party system does not make it a democratic country. I call it myself, is the dictatorship of two parties.
Right.
So if you are not one of those two parties, you can never get to power. That's a dictatorship, or dictatorship of the parties of power. The way I say the system has to change is that system means that some other parties needs to get in, or somehow we have to adapt to some of the systems around us, like maybe in Europe,
right,
to where it's starting to present more views than just the two-party views. Who's been in power for hundreds of years, and the saying, power corrupts. And that's what's happening now. You run under any of those parties, and you pretty much would have to follow what you're being told to do.
Right.
And that's how AIPAC really managed to control the policies. It is by dictating who can get into the legislation, and they tell them up front, you just have to follow what we tell you to do.
Right.
So I don't think really the capitalism as it started.
Right.
Remember, capitalism could be can progress.
Right.
To become like what we see today. Capitalism as started, which is a competition in order to get development and moving forward, is correct. But when you start exposing your teeth to where you have very limited people who's doing that, the capitalism we see today, big companies, they eat the small companies. Those ones at the end, all they are after is more profit. So they are not interested in the citizens moving forward.
I see. I'm gonna change the topic now, even though this is really interesting. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but that's something I ask all of my guests. Because, for example, like when I had on Chase Oliver is a libertarian who works a lot with leftists. Some of the leftists might say that capitalism is inherently bad, or that the system is kind of inherently corrupt on a more profound way, on a deeper way. But his views would actually align more with those same progressives than, say, with Republicans, because libertarians believe in restoring accountability to the community. When there's really grave police violence in the United States, when people get killed for no reasons, libertarians usually oppose that kind of qualified immunity that lets police officers do what they want. And so I always have to ask people, okay, you're obviously going to agree with some people on some issues, and disagree vastly on other issues. But Ziad, you actually have a very different worldview than a lot of the people in movement for humanity, and I find that interesting. Like, how far is um if there were peace in Palestine, you think you would still um be friends with like Tim, for example? Or
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
what I mean by that is, of course you'd be friends with him, but do you still think you'd be um on the same side as him, as what he's saying?
No. I will not be in the same ideology or same side,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'll be friends.
So because of the conflict, you're able to find common ground with someone who actually has a very different ideology.
Different
Because,
ideology
yeah,
is
It's
all
much more important to prioritize liberation for Palestine than anything else.
certainly, but overall, different point of views is healthy.
Right.
That's how you can get to the consensus from the majority, and then that would be the right way to do it. And that's what democracy is all about.
Right.
So, but in my point of view, I don't think communism is the way to get us to liberate Palestine.
Hmm.
And I don't think, as a matter of fact, let me just make another statement in here. Religions, never believe that there is a religious war.
Right.
Most of the wars was, if religion was part of it, it's because somebody in politics have used religion
Yeah.
to advance his agenda or to carry the war, even from the ancient time.
Mm-hmm.
I am well-rounded with all three religions.
Yes.
None of them advocate violence. None. I'm going to give you here one verse we have. I'm Muslim, and
Yes.
one verse from the Quran. And this verse, everybody needs to know it. It says, God says, if you kill a human, as if you killed all humanity. He never mentioned Muslim or Christian or Jew. He said human.
Right.
And if you believe in God, you know what that means. It only means that He is the one who created that human. So if you kill that human, you're killing God's creation. So that's why He said, if you kill a human, you kill as if you killed all humanity. So how could possibly, and as a religious person from any of those religion, you would have a conflict with somebody from the other religion?
Right.
I mean, there's so much in common between you and him.
Yeah.
Than differences.
What I found very interesting, as I started exploring Eastern Orthodoxy, because I grew up in a regular Methodist church, like an evangelical American style church, is that there's some sects of Christianity which are far, far more supportive of Israel than others. And I wanted to know why that is. My dad is actually from the Lebanese Maronite diaspora. So the Catholics who see themselves as allies of France in Lebanon. And because of that, I was really confused. So why does my dad have an opposite view as like pretty much every other Arab? Because he'd say to me like, oh, the Palestinians are our enemies. And I'm like, Dad, that's not true at all. And like, I don't even understand why you would say that. And so I looked into the history of it. It's because the Maronites had so much more privilege over anyone else in Lebanon because the French, to maintain their empire, gave them that privilege. They basically guaranteed, they did at one point legally guarantee that the president of Lebanon had to be a Maronite. And it was just an excuse to exercise power over everyone else. But for the Protestants, like evangelicals who support Israel in the US, I think a lot of it has to do with the way Protestants actually colonized America in their conquest of America. They had a theology of being a new Israel and sort of a new promised land. That the Native Americans who they wiped out and did genocide against were like the people in the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and other peoples that the that the Bible says that Israel annihilated when they came into their promised land. There are some interpretations of religion, especially in what religions teach about war, and when religions And when people misinterpret those verses from the Bible to think that, well, our war is justified as well because we're like the new Israelites. That's actually heretical. That in the early days of Zionism, that was considered a heresy by most Jews and by most Christians. Now it's totally changed somehow through manipulation of public opinion and manipulation of the narrative. It's I think part of it's just shorter attention spans. Like people don't pay attention to that. People don't think in that way, like why that actually is. But that is, I think, still the underlying sentiment is that people will say that, well, because the biblical Israelites did this in the Bible, then the modern day Israelis are able to do this as well. And it's just wrong. It's putting yourself in God's shoes, to be honest. It's putting yourself, it's giving yourself the authority to suppose what God would think.
I agree. I totally agree. And, I don't know if the way to solve the problems in the world that everybody will have to claim their ancestors' land.
Right.
And just look at it. We, all of us today, the whole world is a melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
So if everybody starts to claim their ancestors' land, where are we going to end up?
Right.
I mean, we're going to end up with wars everywhere.
Right.
Needless to say that, we as human altogether, and that's where it comes in from Movement for Humanity,
mm-hmm.
we can live together. The difference between us and everybody else is that we can create peace, we can communicate, we can resolve differences.
Mm-hmm.
That's why when you said about Tim, and if there's so many Tims in Palestine, down the road, I can resolve the
right.
because he has the right for his opinion. I have the right for my opinion. Whoever can convince the majority, this is the right way to do it. That's how it's going to go. And in here, the way I look at it is that all these conflicts, whether it's in Palestine or even all over the world, it's being made for some selfish interest.
Right.
So yeah. I think, and this is something on the subject. I think the Israelis or the Jews should be more upset on the Germans than the Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
The Germans killed 6 million of them in the Holocaust. We didn't kill no 6 million people. We were actually victims in the Holocaust just as much as they were.
Right.
So why would they all advocate that we have to kill the Arabs? We are not the one who killed you in the Holocaust. Now, talking back in history, and if we want to keep always going into that, before they even came from Egypt, there was the Canaanites in there, which is the Palestinians.
Right.
So are we going to say, okay, well, we need to take it back because you came from Egypt on us, and that's our land in there? I think the narrative itself is wrong, that, since our ancestors were there, this is our land. Otherwise, we need all of us to get out of here and go back to our countries from the United States and give back the country to the indigenous people.
Well, I mean, Theodore Hess, who was the founder of the Israeli Institute for Hebrew, argued in an op-ed once that in order to remake Hebrew, it would actually be necessary to copy from Arabic, because Arabic is also a Semitic language. And the mental gymnastics that he did is really, really weird. He wrote this, that the majority of roots found in Arabic vocabulary were once part of the Hebrew lexicon. And all of these roots are not foreign nor Arabic, but are ours, which we have lost and have found again. And the modern Hebrew is an amalgamation of Yiddish, it's a reconstructed language. So to me, the claim that Israelis make that Arabs are not indigenous when they had to change their language to actually be more Arabic is really, really ironic to me. So I think it's not that ancestry is entirely irrelevant, because you can't look at the I think people need to talk more about who the Palestinians are. Now, the Gnassids, the first Arabic-speaking people, came to Palestine in 700 AD, so way before the founding of the U.S. 700, 800 years before the founding of the U.S. They came, or I should say the discovery of the Americas, not the founding of the U.S.
Yeah.
And what I found by like in that book, Palestine: A 4,000-Year History, is they didn't push the Aramaic speakers out. The Aramaic speakers and other groups and other people of other lineages in Palestine just naturally began to identify with Arabic civilization because they're the ones who brought trade and who created kind of a civilizational identity in that region. So it's never the case that like one group completely displaces, unless until the modern world. This idea of like completely displacing another group, completely wiping out another group is actually a really modern idea. It's a modern understanding of ethnicity.
Yeah. Let me just make a comment in here that
Yeah.
Palestine prior to the Zionists coming in there was, and I wish I brought you a coin I have from 1927, Palestinian coin, which is written on it in 3 languages, in English, Hebrew, and Arabic.
Right.
And that's an indicative for the 3 religions. So Palestine never had any issues with accommodating all 3 religions.
Yeah.
And they all lived, a lot of the older people since died, you know, they used to tell us that they lived to next, their neighbors would be Jewish people, and they lived in peace, and they have, you know, food together. So it's Zionism, or the Zionists who came from after the Second World War, is the one who changed some of those people's views. You know how it is sometimes.
They began to think of race as like something where it's like,
yes,
like you know what I mean, like it's cut.
Yes,
like it's something very, very definite about a person.
It is the fact that, you know, and you can see that a lot of I have never been to a synagogue, but a lot of the some of the people who's with us will tell you what kind of education they get in the synagogues. In a way, it should be good. They tell them that they are better than others, not by their lineage, you know. It's because they should be better. They should do things better. But some others take it the other way around. That you are better means the others are less than you.
I see.
And that happens all the time in Israel. That's why you see a lot of radical Israelis look down at the Arabs.
Right.
And you know, this is some.
So what you're saying is that's interesting to me. I think I get what you're saying, that the actual interpretation of how it's how the Torah is supposed to be interpreted is that you're made better by your actions.
Yes.
Not that you're better and therefore your actions are inherently better.
Yes.
Are inherently justified.
Exactly. And that understanding created the animosity you see today in Palestine by looking down at those Palestinians, and they say, you know, they need to go. They are lower people than we are. And that's why Israel, as a matter of fact, in their apartheid system, consider the Palestinians to be second-class citizens. So it's a methodical process which they have started. And now we can see it widespread. Today, for example, 70% of the Israelis support the genocide or the cleansing of Palestine from the Palestinians. While this number was a whole lot less if you go back about 30-40 years ago. So and this is dangerous. This is really dangerous. It sets a dangerous precedent for anybody, even in the West, because we are the ones who advocate for equality and humanity.
Right.
And now, if we are to support Israel, the one who does what's doing today in Palestine, how are we going to answer to our to the world who look up to us? I'm talking about maybe the Africa or Asia. How can we answer them to say, well, no, we're different?
Well, I think the U.S. has already lost that.
Yes,
pretty much entirely, especially with the Iraq War, because that was the first point in history that I can think of where it was everyone else voted against the Iraq War except for the U.S. and Israel. And that pattern is exactly what we see in the world right now, where everyone else is in favor of sanctioning Israel. All the UN member states, Russia, China, everyone wants to sanction Israel. and there's always two or three abstentions. It's either the U.S. and Israel abstain, the U.S. and Britain abstain, or the U.S., Britain, and Israel abstain. And so I don't think the U.S. has moral credibility much longer. The exception is maybe in Argentina, because Argentina wants to go on the dollar. But in every other developing country, like Mexico, Brazil, the BRICS countries, they all are beginning to see the U.S. as an imperial power rather than a power to look up to. They want to get rid of the dollar.
I totally agree. Everybody should ask the question is, for Israel, if today they would have a peace with Lebanon.
Right.
And who's the enemy? Let's forget about Iran. Let's say that they have peace with their direct contact, which is Lebanon. With that army they have built, which is 150,000 active members and 350 reserve, what are they going to do? Are they going to just become more civil society? Or are they, since they have that overflow of power, they're going to have to go somewhere else? Smotrich has the map of Palestine and Jordan on his booth when he was speaking. So ultimately, just like what the United States did after the fall of the Soviet Union, is now you are the only superpower. You have overflow of power. Mm-hmm. You have all, like one of the Zoom meetings we have seen, they have all these nukes, they have all these equipment. Right. What are they going to do with it? So they're going to have to expand their power. So I think Israel will not stop even if they have peace today.
The fact that there's a standing military creates the demand.
That's what happened in Iraq in the 80s.
Right.
When Iraq went to war with Iran in 1980 to 1988, when the war ended, there was 1 million soldiers in there. What are you going to do with them? So he ended up thinking that the next thing is going to be Kuwait, and the next thing is going to be Saudi Arabia. You have all this force which you have trained, spend a lot of money on them, and the only thing they know is to fight.
Right.
What are you going to do with them? You're not going to put them in factories to start making milk or cheese,
Right.
So I think Israel will not stop, even if today there is.
It's a militarized society.
It is militarized, yeah.
So what do you think the real solution is? Given the fact that most people believe that the war has to continue, most Americans and most Israelis, most Americans support a ceasefire. Most Israelis believe that the war has to continue. How can the U.S. and how can the world actually rein in Israel?
For me, as being anti-war advocate myself, the only way this can end is by the people who advocate for peace.
Right.
Spread the word and gather, and so it becomes a movement to change the system.
Right.
To start thinking in terms of humanity and how can humanity live in peace together. I would say this is for the United States, solely for Israel. A lot of Israelis today, although they find the propaganda and there tells them we have to go on a war in Lebanon and then in Iran, a lot of them are tired of war. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't you rather be living in peace after 70 years? So I think if we find somebody who can come into power in Israel and start telling them that it's time to make peace, like what Rabin did in 1995. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, they assassinated him because somebody did not want peace. I think there can be found peace between the Palestinians and the Jews. And this is here important, not the Zionists.
Right.
There's never going to be peace with the Zionists. Zionist is a movement which advocates imperialism. It's not, you cannot find common ground with them. But there is a symbol that you can find common ground in the people living in Palestine, whether they are Jews or Muslims or Christians, and create a peaceful state in there to where all of them can live in there peacefully.
Right.
Once again, religions get you closer together. It does not make you far apart.
I see.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for me as a young person in the U.S. when there's some, places where it's very obviously acceptable and you're invited to share your views, and other places it's very hostile to share your views. How do you have the thick skin and the courage?
Well, to begin with, you're asking me for advice, and I should be asking you for advice. I mean, look at you at your age, and you devoting all this time to a lot of things that I've seen myself, where I've seen a lot of others in your age would rather be in bars or restaurants or out in the street and something like that.
Do you think I don't go to bars ever?
Well, I mean, at least you're devoting some of your time.
My friend Vince says that if I hadn't met him, then I'd still be hanging out in like brunch bars. That sounds like what my friend
Well, says. There's times when you are young, you do stuff like that, but still, I think you are the minority, not the majority, to where you can devote some of your time to these issues.
Right.
Whether you do this podcast or being with us in Movement for Humanity or joining us on these protests. Some people I know from even our country, which they have more to lose, they won't do what you're doing. So what's my advice to the others who is not doing what you're doing is to join you and try to open up to what do they want for their future. This is their future. I'm 67. Best case scenario, I'll live 100. So I don't have a whole lot to live. A lot of you have the future ahead of you. And if this country, and so is Israel, the whole world, as a matter of fact, does not go on the right track, we're in trouble. And in the United States, as a matter of fact, from my vision, the way I've seen it since I've been here since the 80s, we are on a fork. We either go correct ourselves and keep going up or maintain what we had,
right,
or going down.
I agree.
So all the young in your age need to think about it, not only in terms of the community. I mean, think about it in terms of yourself. Would you want to live in a world which is threatened by World War III every day, to where you wake up in the morning, you say, maybe I'm going to be in here, or maybe do I need to want to have a child who may not live to be my age because of the threats we have in the world today? So ultimately, they all have to get involved and change the system.
Yes.
And here, when we say change the system, not like the way Tim would say it, but it creates legislators to where they can advocate and peace and spread humanity and human rights like the way it was.
I see. Ziad, thank you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure speaking.
It's my honor to be here, and thank you.